Shaquille O'Neal never raised his voice. But when a racist bank manager dropped his mother's ID like trash, he didn't just walk away. He pulled $5 billion out the door. What no one knew, that moment was being watched, recorded, remembered. And now the empire that thought it was untouchable is about to crumble from one silent decision. This isn't revenge, it's legacy. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. In a city where people kept their heads down and their doors locked even on sunny days, there moved a man who made shadows look smaller. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just tall, he was present. Wherever he went, people felt it, but not in the way they might expect from a global icon, a former NBA champion, or a billionaire entrepreneur. No, when Shaq stepped onto a sidewalk, it wasn't fame that followed him, it was warmth. Every morning in Atlanta, before the streets filled with impatient honks and over-caffeinated ambition, Shaq would be at his mother's house by 8:15 sharp. Not because she asked, not because she couldn't drive, but because it was their rhythm, an old beat that fame never interrupted. Lucille O'Neal, his mother, still lived in the same brick home, with the creaky porch and wind-chimed awning she had decades ago. He'd walk in without knocking, call her mama like he was still 9, and she'd be in the kitchen frying eggs she knew he wouldn't eat but always appreciated. On this morning, the sun lit their city gold. Summer hadn't reached its heatstroke peak, but the humidity already whispered its warnings. Shaq leaned against the kitchen doorframe, arms folded, watching his mother in that familiar soft silence. She moved slower now. Her steps were measured, her eyes a little dimmer, but her presence, her presence was undiminished. The same woman who had once worked 2 jobs while raising children, who prayed before dinner and after heartbreak, who reminded him that money didn't change blood or the worth of a soul, still treated him like the boy who needed reminding to tie his sneakers. He didn't talk much when he was with her. He listened. She had stories for every silence and wisdom tucked into every corner of her sentences. They laughed, not loudly, but completely. And when it came time to drive her to the bank that morning, Shaq grabbed her purse before she could reach for it, walked her out like she was made of porcelain, and opened the car door like he was her chauffeur and she was the only VIP that mattered. Traffic was light. They drove through old streets where Shaq once rode a bike with training wheels, past playgrounds that still had the same rusty swing chains. Lucille hummed a gospel tune under her breath. Shaq glanced at her once, her hand on the window, her eyes far away, and for a moment he was no longer a mogul. No commercials, no boardrooms, just a man with a mother and a lifetime of gratitude riding in silence between them. When they reached the bank, he insisted on going in with her. She told him she could handle it. He told her he knew that, but it wasn't about handling. It was about standing beside the person who'd held him up for so many years. Still, she waved him off. "Let me have this one alone today, son," she said, with a small smile that carried both strength and memory. So he sat in the car trusting. Shaq didn't wear suits when he wasn't working. That day, he wore a charcoal gray t-shirt, gym shorts, and a pair of size 22 sneakers custom-made with an embroidered phoenix rising from the heel. He looked like an off-duty superhero, lounging in an Escalade, but his mind wasn't idle. He thought about the meeting he had later that afternoon. A deal worth billions, one that had the power to transform urban communities across 3 states. His team had spent months preparing. They'd vetted institutions, scoped out integrity, reviewed histories. Everything pointed to this bank as a secure partner. Everything, except what was happening inside its marble lobby right then. Back inside, Lucille waited in line. Her purse was small, her ID in hand. The suits that buzzed past her didn't look. She didn't expect them to. She wasn't there for recognition, only verification. The teller, a young woman with high cheekbones and a tone like unfinished sentences, gave her a strained smile and asked her to wait. Lucille didn't complain. She sat. She hummed. She watched people with $10,000 watches walk by her like she was part of the furniture. After 20 minutes, she was finally called to a desk tucked into a corner. The nameplate read, Harlan Creek, Senior Finance Manager. The man behind it looked like he was built entirely out of starch and superiority. Thin-rimmed glasses, hair parted by a ruler, a jawline that never smiled. Lucille handed him her ID. He took it without looking up. His fingers barely touched hers. He scanned the card, then her, then the screen. Something in his expression shifted, tightened. He stared at the ID a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked directly at her and asked her to confirm her full name. She did. He asked for her address. She repeated it. He asked for her relationship to Shaquille O'Neal. She answered calmly, "I'm his mother." Then he asked her to wait again while he ran a few checks. He stood and walked into a back office. Lucille waited. A woman behind her cleared her throat loudly, clearly impatient. Another sighed. A security guard glanced in her direction but said nothing. When Harlan returned, he didn't sit down. He hovered behind the desk, holding her ID by its edge like it was contaminated. Then, without flinching, he let it slip from his fingers. It fell to the floor between them. No apology, no explanation. Just dropped. Lucille blinked. For a moment no one moved. Then slowly, she bent down and picked it up herself. "I'm sorry," she said instinctively, like all women conditioned by decades of enduring discomfort. He didn't respond. Outside, Shaq checked his phone. A message from his attorney popped up. Something about a finalized clause. He started to type a reply, then paused. Something pulled at his gut. The kind of quiet tug you get when you sense a shift in atmosphere even through glass. Lucille exited the bank a few minutes later. ID neatly tucked back into her purse. Her eyes didn't reveal what happened. She didn't mention the man in the marble suit. Shaq opened her door and asked if everything went okay. She hesitated. Then said, "Yes, baby, everything's fine." But something in her voice wasn't. Back at home, she kissed his cheek, thanked him for the ride, and told him not to be late for his meeting. He nodded, watched her walk into her house, and then sat quietly for a while, the kind of quiet that lives under your ribs. That evening, as the city lit itself in gold and red and steel blue twilight, a different kind of fire began to burn in Shaq's mind. He didn't scream. He didn't post. He didn't even call his team right away. But something had shifted. Not in the boardroom, not in the numbers, but in the soil of trust. That day had started like any other, with eggs and gospel tunes and a son driving his mother through memories. But by the time it ended, the world had already started to tilt, and none of them, especially not Harlan Creek, had the faintest idea how deep that tilt would go. Shaq wasn't a man of vengeance, but he never forgot how things felt. And this felt like the beginning of something no apology could undo. Harlan Creek stood in front of the tall mirror inside the executive lounge, adjusting the knot of his dark burgundy tie with the precision of a surgeon. His reflection didn't just show him, it confirmed him. Clean shave, teeth-like symmetry, suit tailored down to the thread, and cufflinks engraved with the initials of a grandfather who had once refused to shake hands with inferiors. That legacy, soaked in old money arrogance, hadn't died. It had evolved, and Harlan wore it like armor. He walked down the hallway of Valemont First Capital, like he owned oxygen. His leather shoes didn't squeak, they whispered. Every nod he gave was slow and dismissive. His staff didn't talk in his presence, they reported. He didn't correct them. He expected it. That's how Harlan had risen, by never compromising the illusion of superiority. Rules were guidelines, power was perception, and as long as he held the keys to the vault, the world bent slightly in his direction. Lucille O'Neal's presence on his schedule that morning hadn't registered as significant. A name on a screen, a verification appointment tied to a larger financial dossier. He didn't even glance at the background briefing. He only noticed when her name appeared on the receptionist's monitor. Mrs. Lucille O'Neal, trust confirmation appointment. The last name triggered a flicker. Then he pulled up the file. His eyes narrowed. The mother of that Shaquille O'Neal. He remembered scoffing aloud. He didn't care about Shaq's NBA legacy or his rags to riches narrative. To Harlan, celebrity was for tabloids and public schools. But Shaq was now part of an investment consortium, a merger of generational wealth, educational reform, and real estate power that had found its way to Harlan's desk 2 weeks ago. It had all looked above board, if annoyingly idealistic. Billions on the line. Underserved communities written all over the proposal. Something about housing for veterans. Community banks. Harlan hadn't liked it, but the board was drooling. Big names, big PR, and big capital, all funneled through the bank's trust management division. His division. Until today. Harlan didn't prepare for the meeting. He didn't think he had to. He entered the consultation room like it owed him silence. Lucille was already seated, hands folded in her lap, posture relaxed but upright. She smiled as he entered, gently offering her ID as though handing over something sacred. He took it without returning the gesture. No acknowledgement, no connection, just data in human form. Her ID was clean, proper, but the name, the face, the tone, it unsettled something in Harlan. She reminded him of someone from his childhood, a woman who worked in the kitchen at his prep school. The way she spoke with grace even when she was dismissed, the way she endured without reaction. Harlan hated that memory, not for what it revealed about others, but because of how small it made him feel back then. He had learned to respond to that discomfort not with growth but with control. He tapped at his keyboard as if solving a technical puzzle. Though the verification process was routine, her records were clear. Trust documentation aligned. But Harlan began probing anyway. "Current address?" he asked, knowing it was already on the screen. "Your relation to the account holder?" Of course, she answered with grace. He couldn't find a crack, so he created one. The final insult was unspoken. He held her ID between two fingers, leaned slightly back, and let it fall. Deliberate, casual, as if her identity, her worth, was less than the weight of plastic. It landed softly on the marble floor. Lucille didn't flinch. She bent down slowly and retrieved it, brushing it off before tucking it neatly back into her purse. She stood without accusation, without pleading. Just that same quiet dignity that made people like Harlan feel small without saying a word. "I'm sorry, but the documents aren't ready for release today," he said smoothly, folding his hands behind his back. "There seems to be some irregularity with clearance." It was a lie. Everything was in order, but she would never be able to prove it. Lucille simply nodded, her voice still steady. "I understand." And with that, she left. To Harlan, it was over. To the universe, it had just begun. The next morning, Harlan sat in his glass office on the 24th floor, sipping imported espresso and browsing headlines about housing markets and stock rallies. His phone pinged, an internal message from the trust division. "Need final sign-off on the O'Neal trust transfer proposal." Harlan stared at it, confused. He thought he had pushed that appointment back indefinitely. He opened the attached file. His name was no longer on the routing list. Neither was his division. A new bank name flashed at the top of the trust distribution chart, one he didn't recognize. Smaller, regional, minority-owned. He frowned, then checked the parent file. The deal had moved. All 5 billion of it. Before he could react, his phone rang. It was someone from compliance. "Hey, just a heads up. There's been a request from corporate to pull all video logs from yesterday's guest meetings. Something about transparency checks." He muttered a yes and hung up, suddenly aware that his fingers were sweating against the polished phone case. He tapped into the internal surveillance system. The video feed from room 4, Lucille's room, had already been archived, labeled, marked for executive review. He watched the footage.
There he was, standing tall. There was Lucille, small in frame but huge in presence. Then came the moment. The drop. That tiny, humiliating gesture replayed in clinical clarity. The kind of footage that, without sound, screamed louder than any confrontation ever could.
He closed the file. Suddenly, the espresso didn't taste right. Across the city, Shaq sat in his home office, watching the same footage. No reaction on his face. Just silence. His attorney sat nearby, waiting for instruction. Shaq leaned back. "Pull the deal," he said simply. "Already done," the attorney replied. A day later, headlines began shifting. Whispers inside the financial world moved faster than official press. Valemont First Capital had lost a major merger opportunity due to internal realignment. Shareholders noticed. Analysts speculated. But inside the upper echelons of that institution, Harlan Creek felt the tremor before anyone else. His name began disappearing from internal memos. Meetings were scheduled without him. Legal sent over a confidentiality update. The tone was cold, unapologetic. The bank didn't fire him. They simply made him irrelevant. By the end of the week, Harlan was still sitting in his glass office, but the view felt colder. Colleagues stopped swinging by for handshakes. The receptionist didn't make eye contact anymore. And every time he looked at that polished marble floor, he remembered the sound the ID never made when it landed. He couldn't explain it. Not to the board, not to the media, not even to himself. How one moment so small, so dismissive, could unravel everything he thought was secured. But it had. Because power doesn't always announce itself with volume. Sometimes it walks in slowly, wearing sensible shoes, carrying an ID card, and leaves with your future tucked in its purse. Downtown Atlanta pulsed with the rhythm of ambition. Towering structures made of glass and steel loomed above the sidewalks, shimmering in the midday sun like polished fortresses. The city hummed with commerce, conversation, and calculated politeness, the kind that dressed exclusion in tailored smiles and quiet rules. Within this maze of mirrored surfaces and air-conditioned detachment stood Valemont First Capital, a private bank built on exclusivity and old money. Its lobby was more museum than financial institution. Polished marble floors, dark walnut counters, brass fixtures that gleamed under clinical lighting. There was no music, no warmth, just efficiency and quiet hierarchy. Lucille O'Neal stepped into this cathedral of commerce holding nothing but her ID and the steadiness that only age and experience can bring. Her dress was modest, navy blue cotton with soft floral stitching, the kind a grandmother might wear to Sunday service. Her shoes were sensible, her purse was small, but her presence carried weight, even if no one in the room paused long enough to see it. The receptionist at the front barely looked up when Lucille approached. She gestured toward the corner check-in tablet without a word. Lucille offered a gentle smile and followed the motion, tapping her name into a screen that didn't recognize her warmth. A prompt appeared asking her to wait in the seating area. She nodded to herself and sat on a bench as firm as it was uncomfortable. Around her, people passed in tailored silence. Bankers in crisp suits clicked down the halls with eyes locked onto phones. Assistants whispered into earpieces, escorting clients with leather briefcases and watch faces that cost more than some people's homes. No one made eye contact. No one said good morning. Lucille folded her hands in her lap and looked toward a painting on the wall, an abstract canvas meant to evoke prosperity, but all it gave her was cold. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. A young teller eventually approached. Blonde hair pulled back tight, voice practiced into customer service monotone. "Mrs. O'Neal?" she asked, not unkind but indifferent. Lucille nodded and stood slowly. "This way, please." They walked down a corridor that smelled of lavender cleaner and policy. Lucille was led to a consultation room where she was told someone would be with her shortly. She sat again, this time in a leather chair too stiff for comfort. On the table before her sat a small vase with plastic tulips and a promotional flyer boasting, "We see your worth." The irony didn't escape her. After several more minutes, the door opened, and in stepped Harlan Creek, senior finance manager. Reputation pristine, resume impeccable. Everything about him screamed control. Salt and pepper hair, manicured nails, a designer watch, and a gray suit so sharply pressed it looked angry. His eyes, though clear, held no welcome. Lucille offered her ID before being asked, holding it out like a peace offering. Harlan took it between 2 fingers, careful not to touch her hand. He didn't look at her, just at the card. His brow twitched. "Lucille O'Neal," he said as if reading foreign text. "Yes, sir," she replied, soft but steady. He stared at the ID longer than necessary, then turned to his computer and began typing. His silence stretched. She watched him with patience, but the air between them was already shifting. It wasn't the pause that made it uncomfortable. It was the intention behind it. He wasn't verifying, he was assessing. "I need to verify some things," he said, eyes still on the screen. "What's your current address?" Lucille recited it. "And your relationship to Shaquille O'Neal?" "I'm his mother." He nodded, but his expression remained unmoved. His fingers continued to move across the keyboard, each click a little too slow, a little too deliberate. He reached for a second monitor, brows furrowing, with performative confusion. "And this meeting is in regard to—" "My son's business team scheduled it," Lucille said. "They said everything was prepared. I was just asked to confirm my identity for some paperwork." Harlan nodded again, still no eye contact. "I see." More silence. Lucille glanced at the clock on the wall. 27 minutes since she'd entered. What should have taken 5 was now dragging into discomfort. Not the loud, aggressive kind. The quieter sort. The kind that makes you feel like you don't belong, even when you're invited. When Harlan finally looked at her, it was like he was seeing through her, not to her. "I'm going to need you to wait here for a few minutes while I check with our compliance officer." Lucille said okay, because what else does one say when authority pretends it's protocol? He stood, ID in hand, and walked out of the room. Lucille exhaled slowly, her fingers tracing the seam of her purse. She wasn't unfamiliar with this tone, this dance. She'd lived through times when signs on doors said what people like Harlan only now said with their posture. She didn't expect the world to have changed overnight, but she had hoped in this tower of steel and silence that basic dignity might still apply. The minutes crawled. When Harlan returned, he no longer held her ID. It rested in his palm, pinched between thumb and forefinger like a used tissue. No apology, no explanation. And then, without breaking stride, he dropped it to the floor. Not with violence, just casual disregard, letting gravity do the humiliating for him. Lucille's heart didn't race, her breath didn't hitch, but her chest did tighten, not from surprise but from confirmation. This was no accident. This was a message. She bent slowly, picking up the ID with practiced grace. Her fingers didn't tremble. She said nothing. Neither did he. The silence between them was now a canyon, and Harlan had made no effort to build a bridge. "Unfortunately," he said, brushing invisible dust from his lapel, "some of the documents appear incomplete. We'll need to reschedule once all parties have proper clearance. Lucille didn't argue. She knew how this dance ended. She placed her ID back in her purse and stood. I understand, she said, voice steady as stone. Thank you for your time, Harlan said, as though dismissing a minor inconvenience. Lucille walked out the same way she had walked in, upright, dignified, and invisible. The receptionist didn't glance up. The security guard by the door didn't nod. No one acknowledged her departure. She passed the same sterile paintings and muted suits, stepping into the sunlight like she was escaping a place that only looked clean. As she approached the car, Shaq was already opening the door. He looked at her face, the calm lines around her eyes, the tightly held purse. Something in his gut turned, but he didn't press. Everything good, Mama?
Yes, baby. Everything's fine.
The ride home was quiet, but not the same kind of quiet. Inside the bank, Harlan returned to his desk, untouched by consequence. His phone buzzed. A colleague asked about lunch. He smiled and replied that he was free. He had no idea that he'd just undone $5 billion worth of future with one small flick of his fingers. And outside, in the city still spinning in glass and steel, the gears had already started turning. The chill of what just happened would spread quietly, one decision at a time, until the cold heart of the bank would feel its own pulse begin to falter. Lucille didn't cry. Shaq didn't ask. But the silence between them that day was a vow. And the story? It was just beginning. In the bones of Valemont First Capital, beneath the sleek panels and high-polish architecture, technology hummed quietly, unnoticed. The main security system, built for protocol and liability, kept its eyes wide during business hours. Visible cameras posted at every angle, approved by regulators, signed off by insurance. But there was another layer, installed silently during a systems upgrade 6 months earlier, buried within the metadata of a much larger infrastructure revamp. A secondary feed, not illegal, just hidden. A tool built by a quiet mind who understood that the most dangerous moments were often the ones no one meant to capture. His name was Elijah Griggs, a cybersecurity analyst hired on retainer by one of Shaquille O'Neal's family trusts. Elijah didn't wear suits. He wore hoodies with security patches stitched into the sleeves. His office wasn't in the city but in the back corner of a co-working space filled with tech startups and overpriced espresso. His job wasn't to interfere, but to observe. Monitor for fraud, track asset leaks, flag inconsistencies. No one really noticed him. That was the point. He was scrolling through logs late one Thursday when a flagged protocol pinged. Not from a public camera. From one of the auxiliary feeds routed through Room 4 at Valemont's downtown branch. At first he thought it was noise. Security updates sometimes tripped the system unnecessarily. But the feed was marked as motion pattern abnormal. That triggered the audio-suppressed review bot, and then it caught it, frame by frame. An elderly black woman seated in a consultation room. An executive towering above her. A small rectangular ID card, held between two fingers, and released. No expression, no apology, just the drop. Elijah leaned in, eyes narrowing behind blue light glasses. He watched it again, slowed it, rewound it, watched the man's posture, calculated the intent. Then he flagged the video with a quiet urgency and encrypted it into a digital packet labeled Priority Level Red. He knew who she was, Lucille O'Neal. And he knew exactly where the video needed to go. 2 hours later, across the city, in a quiet room at Shaq's Atlanta compound, a soft ping interrupted the low hum of music playing from wall-mounted speakers. Shaq was alone, seated beneath a wall of framed memories, jerseys, family portraits, newspaper clippings, and a single painting of his childhood home done in oil strokes. He rarely sat still, but that night he needed stillness. His mother hadn't said much after the bank visit. She never did when something cut deep, but her silences had a weight to them, and Shaq had carried that weight long enough to know when it changed. He opened the file. It loaded slowly, like the universe wanted him to feel every fraction of anticipation. The footage began with Lucille walking in, sitting, handing over her ID. The man across from her, Harlan Creek, scanning her card without eye contact, leaning back, letting it fall. Shaq watched the rectangle fall like a stone in his stomach, watched his mother bend, pick it up, saw her composure, her dignity, her restraint. He didn't blink, didn't move, just leaned forward. He played the footage again. And again. There were no raised voices, no threats, no overt act of harm. But the violation was complete. The insult was buried in posture, in calculated dismissiveness, in the way power was used like a scalpel, not to wound, but to erase. Shaq didn't clench his fists, didn't curse, he just stared. The kind of stare that comes from places deeper than rage. The kind that's built on years of seeing rooms like that, watching mothers walk out of them with invisible bruises. The kind of stare that's born from the realization that even when you reach the top, they still test the worth of your name through the people who raised you. He closed the laptop slowly, not out of anger but reverence. Outside the room, his assistant waited, a young woman named Callan Royce, quick-witted, fiercely loyal, and unusually fluent in the unspoken rhythms of Shaq's world. She didn't need to ask what he saw. The silence told her everything. "Send word to the legal team," he said, standing up. "No public moves yet, but the deal's off." Colin nodded and began making calls. Her voice stayed even, but inside, she burned. Not because the deal was collapsing, but because she'd met Lucille once at a foundation dinner, and the way the woman had smiled at her like they'd known each other in another life still lived in her memory. By the next morning, the video was secured on a private server. Only 3 people had access: Shaq, Elijah, and Shaq's senior counsel, Gideon Cray, a man who had once been a civil rights litigator and now managed billions with the same fire. Gideon watched the video in silence. When it ended, he sat back and breathed through his nose. "Do we release it?" Colin asked over speaker. "Not yet," Shaq said from his end. "Why not?" she asked. "Because we don't make noise," he replied. "We make change." There were no social media posts, no press conferences, no leaked footage, just a quiet flurry of decisions made in legal rooms, business lounges, and private networks. Shaq didn't need the world to know. Not yet. He needed the world to feel it later. And for that, timing mattered more than outrage. Back at Valemont, Harlan remained oblivious, still confident, still immersed in numbers and projections, still assuming that his decisions inside that marble room were private. He hadn't reviewed the surveillance protocols in years, didn't realize a second feed had ever been installed. He didn't ask because men like him never thought they were being watched unless they were on stage. And this moment hadn't been a performance, it had been a slip. And that made it dangerous. The bank's IT team didn't know the feed had gone out. Elijah had tunneled access through encrypted legal monitoring channels embedded months ago. No trace, no footprint. The system had been designed not just to witness injustice, but to preserve it, unaltered and unedited, until the moment when truth became necessary. Shaq didn't sleep that night. Not from unrest. From calculation. He walked outside into the open air, the moonlight hitting the pavement like silver ink. The sky was quiet. His home overlooked the lights of the city. His city, the place where he had planted so many seeds, built schools, funded scholarships, helped rebuild youth centers and community programs. His money had touched thousands, but still the cold marble of one man's prejudice had found a way to cut through all of it. He thought of his mother, of her silence in the car, of the way she had said everything's fine with that smile she wore only when everything absolutely wasn't. And that was when Shaq made the decision that would shift the ground beneath a bank built on cold policy and colder prejudice. Not with a lawsuit, not with a protest, but with a realignment of wealth, influence, and silent accountability. The footage would remain sealed for now, because what was coming next wouldn't require an audience. It would require precision and patience. Because sometimes the camera doesn't just witness injustice. Sometimes it becomes the blade that cuts quietly. There were no speeches, no press releases, no slick videos with cinematic music and panning shots of justice being served. When Shaquille O'Neal moved, he did so like an undertow, slow, deep, and unseen until everything above the surface began to shift. After the surveillance footage landed in his inbox and the cloak deal pivoted behind closed doors, Shaq never once raised his voice. He didn't give in to outrage. He didn't call a single news outlet or threaten legal retaliation. That wasn't his way. Rage is loud. Fire, when controlled, is much more dangerous. Instead, Shaq did what he had learned from a life of being underestimated. He made the silence work for him. The next morning, Shaq's team gathered on the 14th floor of a modest office tower in downtown Atlanta. It was early, before the phones started ringing, and before coffee shops filled with chatter. Callan Royce walked into the room first, carrying a binder as thick as a briefcase. Gideon Cray followed with his laptop already unlocked and a list of legal transfer protocols glowing on the screen. Elijah Griggs was on the video call, live from his dim-lit workspace, sipping from a steel mug labeled "Encryption Before Emotion." Shaq walked in last. No suit. Just a dark hoodie and tailored slacks, the kind of clothing that said comfort and command at the same time. He sat at the head of the table and nodded once. "We're moving forward," he said. That was all. No rage, no war plan, just a direction. The smaller, black-owned institution Providence Bank and Trust, based out of Birmingham, had already been looped in through encrypted channels. Their CEO, a former teacher turned financier named Langston Reed, had quietly been preparing for this moment ever since his proposal was shelved in the second round of reviews months ago. He had known he was the moral choice, not the strategic one. But now, through a twist no one could have predicted, the deal was his to carry. Providence wasn't built on flash. Its offices weren't glass towers, they were brick buildings with roots in neighborhoods the world had long ignored. But what they lacked in size they more than made up for in soul, and that was the one currency Valemont could never counterfeit. With Shaq's team behind them, Providence would scale. The infrastructure would be upgraded. The compliance department would double in weeks. Langston, who had started his financial journey managing church accounts and small black-owned businesses during the 2008 recession, was now at the helm of a $5 billion distribution engine. The first thing Shaq said to him was simple: "Don't forget who you're doing it for." Langston smiled. "I never have." Behind the scenes, Gideon coordinated the dismantling of all remaining ties to Valemont. Contracts were voided cleanly, using clauses so carefully buried in the original agreements that not even Harlan's legal team saw the storm coming. No messy fallout, no dramatic breach, just redirection, swift, precise, surgical. Within 48 hours, every trace of Valemount's role in the deal was gone, like a signature scrubbed from a dry erase board. Harlan Creek, however, remained oblivious. He was still in his office, reading headlines about black-led community investment breakthroughs, an historic economic merger underway. He still believed Valemont was at the center. He still thought his name would be on the next Forbes mention. He had started outlining a speech he planned to give at a national banking conference in Chicago, a speech about inclusion, about legacy, about the future of fair finance. No one had told him he was irrelevant. He found out through subtraction. First, his executive access to the cloak documents was temporarily suspended due to restructuring. Then his invitation to the internal development conference was quietly withdrawn. His assistant's emails to Shaq's team bounced back. No explanations, no apologies. Just air. Harlan asked the board what was happening. The board told him they were looking into it. Then came the memo. It was drafted by Gideon and reviewed by Shaq before being sent. Polished, legal, devoid of emotion. Just a statement: "We've decided to pursue a more values-aligned partnership moving forward. We appreciate your time." That sentence, so clean, so harmless on the surface, unraveled Harlan's entire future. He read it 3 times before he understood. He wasn't just out of the cloak deal. He was out of the narrative entirely. In the days that followed, Vailmont's public posture began to falter. Rumors circulated in private channels that they had been rejected from a high-profile merger due to compliance misalignment. Their PR team tried to spin it, but the press, sensing blood in the water, began asking questions. Why had Valemont gone silent? Who was behind the pivot? Shaq never gave a comment. He didn't need to. Instead, he visited one of Providence's smallest branches in Montgomery, Alabama. No cameras, no press, just him, Callan, and Langston walking into a sun-washed building filled with potted plants and old church flyers. Shaq sat down with a local single mother applying for her first home loan. He shook the hand of the bank manager, who had once been denied a promotion at Valemont for lack of executive polish. He laughed with a teenage teller who nearly passed out when she recognized him. The photos from that visit weren't taken by a media crew. They were snapped by a local high school senior with a cracked phone and posted on Instagram with the caption, "Shaq out here real for real." The post went viral in hours. That's how the world learned who really got the deal. Not from press statements, but from authenticity. Meanwhile, Harlan began unraveling. Not in public, not in scandal, but in quiet irrelevance. His colleagues stopped CCing him on key memos. Board members avoided eye contact. A younger executive began receiving temporary assignments that used to be his. At one board lunch, Harlan reached for the speaking folder and was met with an awkward silence. It wasn't a coup, it was erosion. He still didn't understand what had triggered it. That was the true genius of Shaq's wrath. It never pointed a finger. It didn't demand retribution. It simply removed the privilege of pretending. Back in Atlanta, Lucille sat in her garden, clipping roses that grew brighter that season. She didn't know the details of what her son had done. He hadn't told her. He hadn't needed to. She felt it in the way strangers began thanking her in grocery store aisles. In the way young bankers from Providence now called her Miss O'Neal with reverence. In the letter she received from a single mom in Detroit whose daycare was now receiving funds from the Cloak Education Wing. She read that letter with quiet tears, folded it neatly, and placed it beside her Bible. Shaq didn't say much about what happened. Not to the public, not even to his closest circle. When asked, he would simply say, "Sometimes you don't have to push back. You just have to step around and let them fall." And fall, they did. Not dramatically, not instantly, but completely. Like a tower built on the assumption that no one was watching, crumbling beneath the weight of a woman's quiet dignity, a camera that shouldn't have been rolling, and a son who believed that the strongest move is often the one made without a sound. Exactly 1 week before Lucille O'Neal's quiet humiliation inside Valemont First Capital, the wheels of one of the most ambitious economic restructuring deals in the southeastern United States were already in motion. It was called Project Cloak, a name chosen not for drama, but for strategy. Not everyone needed to know where the money was going. Not yet. The reveal would come later, like the final move on a board that had been mapped out a dozen steps in advance. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't new to philanthropy, nor to business. He'd grown from sneakers and slam dunks into a network of ventures, restaurants, real estate, educational programs, health initiatives. But Project Cloak wasn't just another investment. This was his answer to a lifetime of watching wealth get built in buildings that locked people like his mother out. It wasn't enough to give back. He wanted to rebuild the ground itself. The plan was complex but elegant. A $5 billion multi-phased merger that combined mid-tier regional banks, underfunded educational trusts, community development centers, and real estate opportunities designed to create ownership in historically marginalized neighborhoods. 3 banks had made it through the vetting stage. One of them, Valemont First Capital, was at the top of the list. Their infrastructure was flawless, their executive suite stable, and their expansion record made them a prime candidate for the flagship role. They were poised to become the primary managing institution for dispersing and supervising funds across 12 states. They stood to control nearly $1.7 billion of the total package. Shaq's team had been in talks with Valemount's executive board for over 2 months. Legal documents had been drafted, portfolios exchanged, and interviews conducted with all key players. The bank's chairman had made personal visits. Their marketing division had even prepped a rollout plan that included photos of Shaq with neighborhood kids and smiling bank managers cutting ribbons. On paper, the marriage looked perfect. And Harlan Creek, he had been quietly positioned to become National Director of Community Asset Growth under the merger. It was a role that didn't exist until Project Cloak offered a framework for it. It came with visibility, influence, and a title he could weaponize at country clubs and economic panels. The board had already given him informal blessing. His name was penciled in, and Harlan had begun preparing press quotes in his head, the kind where he could say things like, "We've always believed in reinvestment," while comfortably forgetting how many times he had personally rejected small business loans to Black and Hispanic applicants over the years. Shaq hadn't met Harlan face to face. That part wasn't necessary. Deals like these were built through teams, agents, lawyers, compliance officers. The big players often stayed quiet until the final act, stepping in just long enough to smile for cameras, shake hands, and sign dotted lines. But behind that quiet, Shaq was watching everything. He moved like a defensive player on the court, studying formations before committing. Each institution had been put through a test, not just of solvency, but of values. They were measured by how they treated their lowest income clients, how they funded community programs without cameras present, how their branch managers greeted customers who walked in wearing working clothes instead of tailored suits. Valemont passed the paper audit. They failed the soul check. But no one knew it yet. Not until Lucille walked into that branch, unaware that her presence wasn't just personal, it was tactical. Shaq didn't need her to go there, she offered. When the trust confirmation paperwork arrived, she volunteered to visit the branch herself. She said it gave her a sense of purpose, a way to stay connected to the mission. It was a simple errand in her eyes, just identity verification. But for Shaq, it became the perfect test, an unplanned truth serum. He hadn't orchestrated it, but when it happened, when that footage reached him, he recognized the moment for what it was, the move that revealed the whole board. Harlan's mistake wasn't just racist. It was stupid. He had no idea how close he was to legacy-altering influence, no idea how high the stakes truly were. He had dropped an ID card thinking he was just flexing invisible power in a private room. What he'd really done was flip the board in the middle of the match. And Shaq, who had spent his life learning patience from hardwood courts and media storms, was already recalibrating every piece. Within 24 hours of watching the video, Shaq convened his senior legal and economic advisory team. The meeting wasn't dramatic, no raised voices, just facts and resolve. "Valemont's out," Shaq said plainly. "Find a replacement. I want someone who earns it." They already had candidates on standby. The runner-up was a Black-owned regional bank headquartered in Birmingham, with a smaller footprint but a stronger moral compass. They hadn't been chosen initially due to limited infrastructure, but with the right investment, that could be fixed. Callan Royce, his executive strategist, made the call that night. Within 72 hours, the new institution was in place. The redistribution of oversight funds shifted with it. Legal rework was initiated at speed. Valemont wasn't informed right away. There was no need for that. Instead, their access to internal merger documents began narrowing. Emails bounced. Deadlines were rescheduled. Their compliance officers were politely told the deal was under revision. And Harlan, he was still drafting his personal transition memo.
He didn't even know he was out.
Because when justice moves quietly, it doesn't trip over pride. By the end of the week, Project Cloak had taken on a new shape. Leaner, bolder, more aligned with its original vision. The $5 billion stayed intact. The mission stayed intact. The only thing missing was the bank that had built its walls too high for a woman like Lucille to be treated with basic respect. Shaq never publicly named them. He didn't need to. He let them watch from the outside as press leaks about the Cloak deal began to surface. Headlines praised the shift toward equity. News anchors discussed the historic opportunity for community banking reform. Social media buzzed with speculation over which institutions had been chosen. Harlan sat at his desk reading those articles, still thinking he was one of the architects. He smiled at the praise, unaware that the blueprints had already been redrawn. Vailmont's executive board held emergency meetings to decipher the silence from Shaq's team. Emails were sent, voicemails left, couriers dispatched with updated contracts. But the silence held, not out of cruelty, but clarity. They weren't being ghosted. They were being forgotten. Back at Shaq's foundation office, a framed blueprint of the Cloak deal now hung in the conference room. At the center of it wasn't a bank, it was a community. And beside it, under a quote printed in gold that read, "Build where they said nothing could grow," was a copy of Lucille's ID card, clean, centered, untouched. The same card that had once been dropped like nothing. Now a symbol of everything. Inside the dim-lit corner office on the 11th floor of Valemont First Capital, Monroe Stokes sat in silence, staring at the same blinking cursor for 38 minutes straight. His office wasn't on the prestigious floors reserved for directors and department heads. It was tucked between storage and archives, far from the glass and prestige, but close enough to the wires where real truths ran. As a mid-level compliance officer, Monroe knew what people higher up pretended to forget, that institutions weren't broken by dramatic acts, but by the slow, deliberate corrosion of integrity. And Valemont? Valemont was rotting. He had been there 8 years, long enough to know how every lie was buried, how every spreadsheet could be massaged into deniability. Monroe wasn't angry when he came in each day. He was numb. But something had shifted the day he read the internal memo confirming that Valemont had lost the Cloak deal. Not because of miscalculations or market shifts, but because something deeper had been exposed. Something they couldn't spin away. What had begun as a routine deal had turned into a phantom ripped away, hushed and buried under new press talking points and confidential adjustments. There was no mention of Harlan Creek, no mention of Room 4, no mention of Lucille O'Neal's ID card hitting the floor. But Monroe, who handled the metadata of internal surveillance archives, had seen the access logs. He'd noticed the irregular ping from the private feed. He didn't need to watch the video. He knew. And worse, he wasn't surprised. Because Harlan's reputation, behind the false charm and polished diction, had been crumbling for years. Monroe remembered the first time he watched Harlan deny a loan to a black veteran who met every criterion. He remembered the slow refusal to hire minority candidates unless they could be slotted into non-client-facing roles. He remembered overhearing a conversation about keeping the Valemont aesthetic. No one said the word racist. They didn't have to. The institution was fluent in dog whistles and deniability. But Monroe wasn't. Not anymore. That night, he opened an encrypted tab, typed into a blank field. No name, no title, just the truth. He wrote slowly, surgically, without emotion. Not a rant. A report. To whom it may concern. I am writing as an internal employee at Valemont First Capital, with access to compliance review documentation, client rejection patterns, and executive review logs. Over the last 7 years, I have documented a pattern of systemic discrimination against black applicants, particularly in small business loan decisions and estate verification processes. This includes multiple rejections that violated internal lending protocols. Most of these cases trace back to the desk of Senior Manager Harlan Creek. I understand the risks of this disclosure, but the system has shielded this for long enough. The Cloak deal was lost not because of financial shifts, but because a black woman was degraded behind closed doors by a man the board once considered untouchable. Enclosed are metadata references and document IDs. Do with it what you must. A witness in the system. He didn't sign his name. He didn't have to. The data would speak. The letter was sent to the Braxton Institute for Civil Equity, a nonprofit watchdog known for exposing institutional bias in corporate America. They weren't flashy. They didn't rely on tweets or viral campaigns. They dealt in investigation, litigation, and exposure with surgical precision. Their motto, "Justice isn't loud, it's consistent." Within 48 hours, they confirmed the metadata. Within 72, they had filed a formal petition with the FDIC, requesting a compliance audit of Vailmont's internal systems, including all client review patterns, video logs, and minority loan approvals from the last 5 years. The wolves had been loosed. The first calls came from Washington, then from state-level finance regulators, then from investigative journalists whose eyes lit up at the scent of hypocrisy dressed in luxury. Inside Vailmont, panic was silent but feral. Meetings ran late into the night. PR advisors were brought in. Crisis management firms charged $50,000 retainers for one-page plans filled with hollow language. Meanwhile, every employee on Harlan's floor began shifting their chairs away quietly, but noticeably, as if proximity itself might implicate them. Harlan still hadn't watched the footage. He was still clinging to the story that some external factor had redirected the cloak deal, still telling himself that he could survive this like every other moment where image triumphed over substance. But the emails kept coming. Questions from compliance, queries from the board, requests from regulatory offices. One by one, departments that used to defer to him began demanding transparency. The board summoned him for a closed-door clarity session. He arrived in a three-piece suit, holding a leather binder and a half-smile. The room, however, was ice. No one rose. No one joked. They weren't there for ceremony. They were there for a reckoning. At the head of the table sat Elaine Vickers, the board chair, who had always treated Harlan like a pet she admired but didn't fully trust. "We've received a packet," she said coldly, "that includes metadata references suggesting your involvement in repeated racial bias incidents, including what appears to be the catalyst behind our cloak deal collapse." Harlan's smile flickered. "That's ridiculous. There's no basis. There's footage." The silence that followed pressed against the walls like weight. "I wasn't aware of any footage," he said, faltering. Elaine didn't blink. Exactly. For the first time in his career, Harlan felt something he didn't recognize. It wasn't shame. Not yet. It was the loss of immunity. After the meeting, he returned to his office and closed the door. He stared at his computer screen. There was a new email unmarked, internal, a download link. He hesitated, then clicked. He watched the footage. His face, his suit, his posture, the drop. He watched her bend. He watched himself say nothing. And for a flicker of a second, he saw how the world would see him, not as a power player, but as a man who chose cruelty in a moment of comfort. That was the image that would follow him now. The Braxton Institute published a redacted version of the metadata log along with a statement. "A culture of exclusion is not protected by silence. We will pursue every legal avenue to ensure accountability is enforced, not just acknowledged." Public reaction was immediate. The story hit national press in under a day. Not because of names. Shaq's team never issued a statement, but because institutions began to whisper. Clients pulled their accounts. Local politicians demanded investigations. Stock whispers shook the financial ecosystem just enough to be felt. In a matter of days, Vailmont was in full lockdown mode. Monroe Stokes watched it unfold from his corner office. He never said a word. But for the first time in 8 years, he sat up straighter. 2 weeks later, the FDIC issued a formal audit request. Braxton filed suit on behalf of 3 previously rejected loan applicants, all black, all now willing to come forward. The case would take time, but the spotlight had already shifted. And Harlan? Harlan resigned. Not with ceremony, not with dignity, just an email to HR, and a notice cleared from his desk in under 30 minutes. No press conference, no farewell cake, just silence. His office was reassigned within 2 days, the glass nameplate removed, his keycard disabled, his LinkedIn bio quietly changed from senior executive to independent consultant. At a coffee shop 3 blocks away, Monroe printed a copy of the Institute's public filing, folded it, slid it into a plain white envelope, walked to the post office, addressed it to Lucille O'Neal, Scio Providence Bank Trust HQ, Atlanta, GA. Inside, he wrote a single line on a sticky note. He dropped your name. The world picked it up. He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. The truth had already spoken. The morning mist had barely lifted off the grass when Lucille O'Neal stepped out onto her porch, small gardening gloves in one hand and a shallow basket in the other. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and blooming jasmine, and the sky above Atlanta spread in soft strokes of gray and pale gold. It was her favorite time of day, not because it was quiet, but because everything in her garden was just beginning to wake up, stretching without noise, growing without permission. Her garden wasn't manicured like those you saw in magazines. It was soulful, a little wild around the edges. Tall marigolds competed with rose bushes. Lavender spilled from its neat wooden box. Tomatoes clung to their vines like they were afraid to fall. And in the center stood her sunflowers, tall and unapologetically bright. She called them her lookups because every time she passed, they made her tilt her head back just enough to remember to breathe. She bent down to check the soil near the hydrangeas, fingers brushing away last night's rain. The ground was softer than usual. Things were changing, not just in the soil. In her house, the landline had rung 4 times since sunrise. Each time she let it go to voicemail, not because she was avoiding anyone, but because the outside world had begun to speak too loudly again. Headlines, texts, messages from people she hadn't heard from in years. All of it came crashing through the calm she had carved for herself. And still, she gardened. Lucille didn't know her image had been seen by millions. She hadn't watched the clip. Didn't need to. She'd lived it. The moment wasn't new. What was new was the world finally deciding it mattered. And she wasn't quite sure how to feel about that. The first knock came mid-morning. A teenage boy from 3 blocks over stood nervously at the fence, holding a bouquet of grocery store daisies and a crumpled note in his other hand. He didn't say much, just handed her the flowers and muttered, "Thank you for, standing there." She smiled kindly, took the flowers and told him, "God sees who we are when nobody else does." More visitors followed. A young black woman with her daughter, both dressed in Sunday shoes, even though it was Tuesday. An elderly neighbor who hadn't spoken to Lucille in months but now couldn't look her in the eyes without welling up. A local teacher who asked if she could quote Lucille in her classroom. A banker from Providence who came just to shake her hand. They didn't come with cameras. They came with presence. Lucille received them all the same kindly, patiently, and without explanation. She offered lemonade to some, cut flowers for others, but mostly she listened. She let them speak, let them tell her what her stillness had meant to them, even though to her it was just another moment in a lifetime of keeping composure while the world tested it. Later that afternoon, she sat on the porch swing and reread the anonymous note she'd received in the mail. It was short, handwritten and unsigned. "He dropped your name." The world picked it up. She held it gently in her lap for a while, her fingers pressing against the paper like it might fade if she blinked. She didn't know who sent it, but she knew what it meant. The moment that had played out in that cold, sterile room, what had once felt like another quiet bruise had rippled far beyond her. She looked toward her garden, toward her sunflowers rising against the sky. A few neighbors lingered at the sidewalk, pretending to check their mail or walk their dogs just a little slower than usual. She waved, and they waved back. There was something different in their eyes now. Not pity, not awe, but reverence, the kind that didn't need noise to be felt. That evening, a package arrived. No return label. Inside, a framed photograph printed on thick matte paper. It was a still from the surveillance footage, Lucille, mid-bend, picking up her ID with her head still high. Below the image, a caption printed in gold. "You didn't kneel. You reached down and stood taller." She didn't hang it. She didn't have to. She placed it on her kitchen counter beside a picture of her late father and a jar of peach preserves she'd been meaning to give her neighbor. Shaq called later that night. Not to talk about the footage, not about the bank, just to check in. "Need anything, Mama?" he asked. "No, baby. I've got my garden. And folks keep bringing me pie," she chuckled softly. "I think I'll be just fine." He didn't press, didn't explain what had happened behind the scenes. She knew him well enough to feel the shift in his voice. She could hear the weight he'd carried in silence. A sun's quiet storm that had already passed and left the world changed. "I'm proud of you," she said, without needing context. There was a pause. "I'm proud of you," Shaq replied. She leaned back in her chair, the wooden frame creaking just like always. Outside, the garden still breathed beneath the moonlight. Crickets sang low in the grass. Fireflies blinked in small rebellions against the darkness. Somewhere far from her porch, institutions were shifting. Papers were being signed, headlines being written. But in that moment, Lucille didn't care to track any of it. Her dignity hadn't been restored by the world's applause. It had never left her in the first place. What she'd endured wasn't a turning point for her. It was a mirror held up to the world. In the days that followed, more letters came. A group of college students sent her a painted mural of sunflowers with the words "Honor Her" written across it. A foundation in Chicago named a new financial literacy wing after her. But she kept returning to her garden, to the soil that didn't care about politics or headlines. That's where she planted her quiet revolution, one seed at a time. The collapse didn't start with a bang, nor with alarms or public firings. It began the way ice cracks beneath the surface, slow, imperceptible, until one day the floor gives way. Valemont First Capital, once a pillar of exclusivity and prestige, began to fracture not from scandal, but from silence. The kind of silence that spreads when no one wants to be the one defending what they once quietly benefited from. It started with a single client account withdrawal, then another, and another. At first, the board told themselves it was a market shift, a correction. Investors moved money every day, but the emails started coming. Subtle at first, more pointed by the week. We're shifting to an institution whose values better reflect our mission. After recent developments, we no longer feel aligned. No statement needed. Our silence is our answer. These weren't angry mobs or boycotts. They were professionals walking away without a word, pulling 7- and 8-figure portfolios like knives from Valemont's chest. The marketing team was the first to panic. Campaigns were canceled. Digital content managers scrubbed mentions of the cloak deal from the archives. They drafted new messaging focused on rebuilding trust, though no one could agree on what they were apologizing for, or even if they should apologize at all. Inside the executive offices, whispers replaced meetings. There were no loud accusations, only reassignments and sudden changes in seating charts. Harlan Creek's name was quietly removed from 3 scheduled events. A finance summit invitation was declined on his behalf. An internal compliance audit randomly selected his department for review. Harlan noticed, but said nothing. For a few days, he told himself it would pass. He had weathered scrutiny before. One edgy decision, one difficult client exchange, that wasn't enough to shake a man like him. He was a fixture, a strategist, Valemont's spine. But the thing about cold empires is that when they start to melt, no one rushes to keep them frozen. The lawsuits arrived next. 3 formal complaints filed by former applicants who had been denied services under Harlan's oversight. The claims were detailed, specific, backed by internal records leaked anonymously. The plaintiffs were smart. They didn't sue for race discrimination directly. They sued for process inconsistencies, violations of fair lending practices, and breaches of fiduciary duty. They weren't emotional. They were surgical. The Braxton Institute joined the legal pursuit, not as an instigator, but as a support structure. They issued statements, not accusations. Their tone was calm, measured, lethal. "We're not here to destroy institutions," one of their lawyers told Bloomberg. "We're here to ask why certain institutions don't believe black clients deserve equal protocols." The public watched and waited. When Valemont's Q3 stock report showed an unexpected 13% drop, shareholders began calling emergency meetings. The numbers didn't lie. Money was leaving. Deals were evaporating. And there was still no official reason why. At the center of it, Harlan Creek tried to hold his posture. He still arrived at the office every morning at 8 a.m. sharp, dressed like nothing had changed, still gave tight smiles to reception, still reviewed reports as if he'd be there forever. But his office grew emptier each day. People stopped stopping by. Memos bypassed him. Junior analysts avoided eye contact in the elevators. Then came the meeting. A small group, behind closed doors. No printed agenda. No coffee on the table. Elaine Vickers, the board chair, didn't waste time. "Harlan," she said, voice level, "this isn't personal, but your presence is no longer stabilizing the institution." He blinked. "My presence?" "The footage is still circulating," she continued. "Discreetly, but it's out there. Clients are aware, our numbers are reflecting it. I never authorized that surveillance." "No one is debating authorization," she said, cutting him off gently. "We're talking about perception, about consequence." "So what? I'm the scapegoat." Elaine looked at him, and for the first time in their long professional history, she let the mask drop just enough. "You weren't a scapegoat, Harlan. You were the catalyst." He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. There was no point. The empire wasn't crumbling because of what he did that day. It was crumbling because of what he represented every day before that. That afternoon, Harlan returned to his office. A formal resignation notice had already been drafted by legal. He was advised to sign it. For reputational purposes, they said, to allow for a clean transition. The words felt hollow, like dust. He looked around the room. His certificates, framed press clippings, a signed photo of him shaking hands with a senator at a finance gala. None of it mattered now. It was all weightless. He packed slowly. A few books, a leather pen holder, a crystal paperweight shaped like a globe. No one came to say goodbye. The office next door, once occupied by his protege, had already been reassigned. Even the janitor avoided looking at him as she emptied the trash bin outside his door. Then, just before he turned off the light, he noticed the monitor on his wall blinking.
General security feed.
Still synced to room 4. He pressed play. And there it was. Lucille O'Neal, sitting calmly, handing over her ID, his own hand, taking it without acknowledgement. The drop. He watched it land. Watched her bend. Watched himself stand, unmoved. He leaned against the wall and let the footage play again and again, until the loop began to feel like a confession. The screen reflected on his face, each frame like a gavel falling. Outside, the office buzzed forward as if he had never existed. A new manager was already being trained. The PR team was working on a new diversity initiative. The company's homepage had swapped its main banner from marble halls to an image of smiling families at community events. Too late. The culture had shifted, and Vailmont's name was now synonymous with everything it had tried to bury. 3 weeks later, a formal statement was issued, not about Harlan, but about new leadership direction. No mention of race, no admission of wrongdoing, just the sterile language of a brand trying to cauterize its own wound. But clients knew. They always do. The final blow came not in the form of a lawsuit or investigation. It came in a Forbes profile, an exclusive feature titled "Providence Rises, the Future of Black Banking in America." The headline photograph showed Shaquille O'Neal standing with Langston Reed and a group of young bankers outside a small, vibrant branch in Birmingham. The caption read, "From Loss to Legacy, How One Silent Pivot Reshaped the Economic Map." Vailmont was never mentioned.
It didn't need to be.
Everyone knew who had been replaced. In a quiet garden in Atlanta, Lucille O'Neal received a clipping of the article, tucked inside a handwritten envelope. No note this time. Just the image and a single sentence highlighted in gold. "Respect isn't given by wealth. It's revealed when power listens." She smiled, folded the article carefully, and placed it beside her Bible. Back at the now rebranded headquarters of Vailmont, its logo changed, its branding softened, its offices modernized. There remained one empty corner office. The glass still bore faint impressions where the nameplate had been removed. The monitor was off now, but the room remembered. It remembered the silence. It remembered the fall. It remembered the moment a cold empire shattered. Not through force, not through scandal, but through the unbearable weight of dignity refused. The morning air in downtown Atlanta was unusually still, like the city itself was holding its breath. No sirens, no street clamor, just a hush, as if the weight of something sacred was about to settle into the soil. The corner of Auburn Avenue and Howell Street had once been another cracked slab of neglected pavement, surrounded by shuttered buildings and the faded echoes of black excellence that used to ring through its blocks. But today everything shimmered with intention. A new structure stood there now. Not tall, not flashy, but proud. Smooth white stone with wide steps and open windows. A building that breathed. Lucille House, the gold lettering read across its curved entrance. Beneath it, smaller words engraved in brass. A place where dignity takes root. The courtyard was already full by 9 a.m. Community leaders, city officials, single mothers with curious kids tugging their sleeves, retired teachers in Sunday hats, college students still rubbing sleep from their eyes. No one had been told what to expect. They only knew Shaquille O'Neal was dedicating a new foundation, and when Big Shaq did something, it wasn't just for cameras. He wasn't the last to arrive. He had been there before sunrise, walking the hallways alone. He'd paused in each room, the training center where young adults would learn how to read loan agreements, the tech lab built for digital financial literacy, the quiet corner library that would house books on Black Wall Street, wealth redistribution and community banking. But he lingered longest in the room at the center of it all, the Dignity Archive, a circular gallery that told the story not just of oppression, but of survival, of people who stood straight while being asked to kneel. At the heart of the archive, under soft amber lights, a display case held a single object. Lucille O'Neal's state-issued ID, untouched, preserved. Below it, an inscription. She bent to pick it up. "We rise because she did." Shaq stood before it, hands in his pockets, eyes distant. No one saw him there, no photographers, no applause, just a son, remembering a moment that would never fully leave him. At exactly 10 a.m., the ribbon cutting began. The ceremony was brief. No corporate sponsors spoke. No politicians grandstanded. Just a quiet introduction by Langston Reed, now the head of the Cloak Initiative's banking arm, followed by a performance from a children's choir who sang a version of "Lift Every Voice and Sing" that made even the stone pillars feel alive. Then Shaq stepped up to the podium. He didn't carry notes. Didn't need them. He looked out at the crowd, paused for a long beat, and began with a voice low and steady. People talk a lot about legacies, statues, records, net worth, what you leave behind when you're no longer walking around in your big shoes. But legacy's not a statue. It's a seed, something you plant and may never see fully grow. And this, he turned slightly, gesturing behind him toward the building, this is for the ones who planted in silence. The wind stirred, as if leaning in to listen. My mother didn't ask to be a symbol. She didn't shout, didn't post about it, didn't want to be known for anything other than being a good woman who raised her kids with love and strength. But one day she walked into a building where someone tried to reduce her down to nothing. Not with words, not with force, just with a flick of his fingers. Just enough to remind her what the world thinks of people like us when we're not wearing a jersey or holding a check. The crowd was still. Not a phone rang. Not a cough broke the moment. And she didn't fight, didn't cry. She picked up that ID. She stood tall. She came home. And I watched her do what she's always done. Turn the other cheek while carrying generations on her back. His voice tightened for the first time. That video went viral. That bank fell apart. People got loud after. But it wasn't the video that broke the silence. It was the moment, the look on her face, the stillness, that quiet fire. And I realized something. That kind of grace doesn't just belong in museums. It needs a home. A place where we don't just tell kids to make it. We teach them how to understand the systems built around them. A place where dignity isn't earned, it's honored. He exhaled, slow and full. So I built this place not just for her, but for every mother who's been asked to prove who she is, when the world already knows. For every young man who never learned what a trust is. For every woman who's ever been handed a loan denial with a smile too polite to be honest. He looked down at the front row where Lucille sat, gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes shimmering but dry. She gave him a small nod, proud, calm, and quietly commanding. "And Mama," he said, "you told me once that justice wasn't about payback. It was about placement, where people are put, where we decide to plant ourselves. Well, this is my placement." He stepped back. No anthem played. No fireworks shot into the sky. But the applause rose like thunder rolled through clouds, full, resonant, long, not wild, grateful. In the crowd just behind a line of youth volunteers, a young girl no older than 9 watched with a seriousness that didn't match her age. Her name was Taryn Hill, and clutched in her small hands was her mother's ID, bent at the corners, old but intact. She didn't understand everything that had happened, but she understood enough, that someone like her could grow up in a world where Big Shaq built buildings named after women like her grandmother. Taryn would visit Lucille House twice a week for the next 5 years. She'd learn budgeting before she learned algebra. She'd study contracts before she ever signed a lease. And when she graduated high school, she'd be the first student to intern at Providence Bank's Community Investment Wing, then return to teach financial literacy to the next group behind her. She'd never forget holding that ID. Back inside the foundation, staff led guests through each wing. Quiet, respectful. No velvet ropes, just gentle guidance. In the main corridor, a mural stretched 30 feet long. Scenes of black families around dinner tables, grandmothers with their Sunday hats, barbershop debates, kids with backpacks crossing city streets. At the center of the mural was a silhouette of a woman holding a card to her chest, gold light rising from it. Below it, one sentence. They tried to define her by what she carried. They forgot she carried us all. Later that evening, after the crowds had thinned and the sun dipped behind Atlanta's skyline, Shaq walked the halls once more, alone, quiet. He paused in the Dignity archive, staring again at the case holding his mother's ID. He thought about the path it had taken, how one careless flick had set off a chain of quiet revolution. He didn't feel victorious. He felt clear. Outside, the building lights glowed warm against the dusk. The city moved on around it. Cars, buses, noise. But something had changed. A piece of the future now had roots in the past. The kind that don't fade, even when stories are no longer told. Because some legacies don't need spotlights. They bloom in the shadows. They walk into banks with a purse and a prayer. They raise sons who build empires out of grace. And they remind the world that dignity, once dropped, doesn't break. It just waits to be lifted. If this story moved you, then remember, change doesn't always need a stage, just the courage to stand. Support businesses that honor dignity. Question systems that silence it. Share this truth in rooms where it's usually whispered. Because sometimes the quietest moments leave the loudest legacy. Be part of building that legacy, one choice at a time.